The United States just imposed a crushing 25% tariff on its closest allies. The reason? They refused to sell Greenland. Now, behind closed doors in Brussels, European leaders are preparing for something nobody thought possible: the end of the transatlantic alliance as we know it. This isn't a diplomatic spat. This is a potential fracture in the foundations of global order. For more than 7 decades, the relationship between the United States and Europe has been the bedrock of Western power. It survived the Cold War, terrorist attacks, financial crises, and countless disagreements. Through it all, one thing remained constant: the assumption that America and Europe were partners, bound by shared values and mutual interests. But today, that assumption is being tested like never before. According to sources with direct knowledge of discussions happening inside European governments and EU institutions, the continent is now bracing for a period of tension with Washington, unlike anything witnessed in modern history. What was once viewed as a stable and reliable partnership is rapidly transforming into something far more fragile and unpredictable. European officials no longer see recent American actions as tough negotiations between friends. Instead, they're interpreting them as deliberate attempts to apply pressure, even coercion, on nations that have stood shoulder to shoulder with the U.S. for generations. So what exactly happened? And why are some of the world's most powerful democracies now openly discussing the possibility of walking away from America? It all started with Greenland. The massive Arctic island, officially part of the Kingdom of Denmark, has been a point of strategic interest for decades. Its location offers access to vital shipping routes, rare earth minerals, and military positioning in an era where the Arctic is becoming a new frontier for geopolitical competition. But when the Trump administration floated the idea of acquiring Greenland, European leaders were stunned. Not because the concept was new. The U.S. had explored purchasing the island before, back in the 1940s, but because of the way it was being pursued this time. Denmark, along with its Nordic neighbors and major European powers like Germany and France, made their position crystal clear. Greenland is not for sale. It will not be negotiated. It will not be transferred under any circumstances. That should have been the end of it. But instead of accepting that answer, the White House did something that shocked the diplomatic world. It announced a new wave of trade tariffs targeting multiple European nations. Germany, France, Denmark, Norway, and several others were hit directly. When combined with earlier trade restrictions, the total tariff rate climbed to an eye-watering 25%. To put that in perspective, these are economic penalties not seen between NATO allies since the height of the Cold War. And this time, they're not aimed at adversaries. They're aimed at America's oldest friends. European officials describe the move as nothing short of extraordinary. In private conversations, many have stopped calling it a trade dispute. They now see it as a political message. Traditional alliances no longer guarantee special treatment in Washington. So how is Europe responding? Publicly, European leaders have been firm but measured. One by one, heads of government have reaffirmed their stance on Greenland. Their statements are deliberate, coordinated, and carefully crafted. Behind the scenes, sources say these declarations are the result of intense closed-door consultations between major EU capitals, all designed to project a unified front. And unity, officials stress, is everything right now. Any sign of division, any crack in European resolve would only invite more pressure from Washington. But Europe isn't just standing still and issuing statements. According to insiders, Brussels is already preparing concrete countermeasures. If the United States continues down this path, the European Union is ready to hit back hard. Plans are being drawn up to impose retaliatory tariffs on American exports. Access to the European market, one of the largest and wealthiest in the world, could be tightened for a wide range of U.S. companies. This isn't limited to one or two industries. We're talking about restrictions that could affect major corporations across technology, finance, manufacturing, and industrial services. European economists have warned that these steps could deliver serious damage to American businesses, potentially rivaling or even surpassing the fallout from the most intense trade wars of recent decades. The message from Europe is clear. We prefer dialogue, but we are fully prepared to defend our economic interests if you force our hand. But here's where things get truly unsettling. Trade disputes, even severe ones, can usually be resolved. Tariffs can be negotiated. Markets can recover. What's happening now, however, goes far beyond economics. Sources close to European policymakers reveal that if the United States were to pursue any kind of aggressive or military-oriented approach involving Greenland, Europe would view it as a direct threat, not just to Denmark, but to the security of the entire continent. In that scenario, European leaders say they would be forced to consider a complete breakdown in political and military cooperation with Washington. That includes reassessing long-standing treaties, defense arrangements, and strategic partnerships that have been the foundation of Western security for generations. Let that sink in for a moment. We're talking about the potential unraveling of NATO, the collapse of the very alliance that has kept Europe secure and stable since 1949. What once seemed like an unrealistic, almost absurd scenario is now being openly discussed in European capitals, and even the most cautious analysts are no longer dismissing it outright. European security experts argue that any use of force involving Greenland would represent a turning point with global consequences. It would shatter the foundations of the current international security system. It would effectively end the United States' role as the primary guarantor of global stability. And it would reshape international relations for decades to come, creating a far more fragmented, unpredictable, and dangerous world. Now, to be clear, European leaders are not preparing for military confrontation with the United States. That would be both unthinkable and impossible. Instead, their strategy revolves around economic tools, diplomatic pressure, and institutional mechanisms designed to protect European sovereignty and uphold international law. Officials in Brussels emphasize that this approach isn't driven by hostility toward America. It's driven by a commitment to defend the principles that have governed international relations since the end of World War II: respect for borders, the rule of law, and the sanctity of alliances. But even as Europe prepares to defend itself, there remains a thread of cautious hope. Some European officials believe that President Trump may eventually soften his position. Others are betting that advisors within his administration will recognize the scale of the risks involved and intervene to prevent a deeper crisis. If neither of those things happens, however, European officials warn that we may be entering a new era. One in which long-standing alliances unravel, one in which trust between former partners evaporates, and one in which economic conflict replaces cooperation as the dominant tool of international pressure. According to people involved in sensitive internal discussions, Europe has reached a point where symbolic gestures are no longer enough. Tangible, coordinated action is being prepared. And the next phase, they say, depends almost entirely on the choices Washington makes. For decades, Europe's political and security architecture has rested on a single, fundamental assumption that the United States would act as a stable, rational, and predictable partner. But that assumption is now eroding. People close to the European Commission and several influential EU governments say that private consultations increasingly reflect a growing skepticism toward the idea of unconditional transatlantic reliability. The use of trade tariffs as an instrument of pressure in the Greenland dispute was a turning point. It demonstrated in the starkest possible terms that economic interdependence, once seen as a stabilizing force, can be weaponized. As a result, discussions have intensified around accelerating Europe's push for strategic self-reliance. These conversations reportedly cover a wide range of measures: the development of independent financial systems, reduced exposure to U.S.-controlled infrastructure, and a significant deepening of military and defense cooperation within the EU that would no longer rely on American leadership. What began as abstract debate has evolved into concrete planning. Timelines are being set. Policy options are being evaluated. Institutional mechanisms are actively under review. And cooperation between Germany and France, the traditional engines of European integration, is gaining renewed momentum. Both governments see the current crisis not only as a challenge, but also as an opportunity to reset the European project. Their vision increasingly points toward a Europe that operates with stronger internal cohesion and greater autonomy, where Washington's role is influential but no longer dominant. For countries like Norway and Denmark, the implications are even more severe. This isn't just about trade disagreements. It touches directly on questions of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and national security. Diplomatic sources warn that any move by the United States toward a military scenario involving Greenland would force Europe into a defining historical decision. The continent would either accept a clearly subordinate position within a US-led framework or embark on a far more demanding path of independence, one that would involve significant costs but preserve strategic self-determination. And European leaders are signaling that economic countermeasures would represent only the initial stage of a broader response. According to insiders, the EU is already evaluating steps that could restrict the participation of American companies in critical sectors, including defense procurement, digital infrastructure, and energy networks. Such measures would be disruptive, no question. But European analysts argue that over the long term, they could gradually weaken U.S. leverage in the region, while simultaneously fostering the growth and competitiveness of European firms. Publicly, officials in Washington have largely dismissed or downplayed these developments. Privately, however, U.S. diplomats reportedly acknowledge that the scale and seriousness of Europe's potential response exceed earlier expectations. And here's where things get even more complicated. Europe's internal deliberations aren't happening in a vacuum. They're being closely observed by other global actors. China, along with several Middle Eastern states, is carefully watching how far Europe is prepared to go in challenging the United States. And they're recalibrating their own strategic outlook based on those signals. What began as a dispute linked to Greenland has now expanded into something far more consequential. It's increasingly seen as a stress test for the durability of the post-war alliance system that has shaped global politics for more than 70 years. European sources note that a complete rupture with Washington would compel the EU to rapidly explore alternative frameworks for cooperation, including deeper engagement with partners it had previously approached cautiously or selectively. This wouldn't amount to an immediate shift away from the Western world, but it would mark the emergence of a multi-directional strategy, one in which Europe prioritizes its own interests above inherited alignments. At the same time, there is a sober recognition among European elites that such a course would carry significant risks. The economic adjustments required would be painful, the political sacrifices would be real, and the strain on European societies and institutions would be considerable. For this reason, Brussels is said to be holding out hope until the final moment that the crisis can be contained through firm economic pressure and strong diplomatic messaging. There remains an expectation that influential figures within the American political and institutional establishment may still succeed in persuading President Trump of the long-term damage that further escalation would cause. But if that effort fails, European sources insist that the continent is more prepared than it has been in decades to act decisively. This time, they say, Europe would defend its interests not through rhetoric or symbolic protests, but through coordinated systemic measures designed to reshape its strategic position. The global landscape now emerging bears little resemblance to the familiar order of the past. For 70 years, the transatlantic alliance has been the cornerstone of Western power and global stability. It has weathered wars, recessions, and political upheavals. It has been tested, strained, and questioned. But it has always endured. Now, for the first time since its creation, that alliance is facing the possibility of collapse. Not because of an external enemy, not because of ideology or incompatible values, but because of decisions made in Washington that European leaders increasingly see as incompatible with partnership. In the coming weeks and months, the choices made on both sides of the Atlantic will determine whether this crisis can be contained or whether it spirals into something far more damaging. If diplomacy prevails, if cooler heads intervene, if economic interests are allowed to guide policy rather than political posturing, there may still be a path back from the brink. But if not, we may be witnessing the birth of a new reality, one in which former allies find themselves separated by growing political, economic, and strategic divides. One in which Europe charts its own course, independent of American influence. And one in which the global order that has defined our world for generations is replaced by something far more uncertain. The foundations are being laid right now, and the world is watching.